Okay, this is part 2. In the first section, we made this so this ripples. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do two things. First, we're going to create some raindrops, and then we're going to create like a constantly moving, rippling surface. So let's go ahead and start with our raindrops. And to start with our raindrops, we're going to create yet another circle. We could have the scale be set the same way we did up here, but in this case, we're just going to do it because it's only one by itself. We're going to go ahead and just do it alone. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to go down and find circle. I'm going to drop this in here. And in this case, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so we can see. I am going to go ahead and I'm just going to name this raindrops. So if we were looking for this in the future, it would be obvious which one this is. Out of the three that it could be. So we've got our raindrops and we need to adjust the scale a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and take this radius down, and I might go actually down to point. I want it to be pretty small. I'm going to do it as 0.05 for both of those values. And now we need to be able to set our position. What we want is we want this circle to basically jump around the frame, right? We already know that if a circle gets plopped in there, it's going to create ripples. So if I was to add this to my comp, right? Oh, there's a circle there, but you'll notice it's an oval. And that's because I did not update the output or the resolution of this, and I didn't update the pixel format either. So I'm going to say, we're going to say custom resolution, change this to 1280 by 720, and we're going to go down and say 32-bit float. That should fix all of that. You can see it's just kind of hanging out there in the center now, not really making ripples because it's not moving. So what we need to do is we're going to go ahead and we need a way to move this around. So let's go ahead and use some noise. So we're going to, and instead of we're not going to be using a noise top, we're going to be using a noise chop. So we're going to go chop. And then if you can't find noise, just type NO and it should be the only one that's not grayed out. So we've got some noise. Now, we only have one channel of noise, but what we'd really like to do is be able to have two channels of noise that we can use to move the X and Y value of our circle. And so if we go all the way, if we select noise and go to channel, you'll note that there's channel 1 here. I'm going to change the name of channel 1 to TX. I'm going to hit a space and I'm going to type in TY. What that does is that space basically says, hey, this is a new channel name. So then it creates two channels. And what you'll notice is each channel, the noise is different, right? These are not the same curves, and that's really, really handy. So now we've got our noise. But if I just go ahead and use these noise values as they currently stand, if I come to noise, I've got it set to sparse. And let's go ahead and set this up. And if I was to grab this now, I want you to note if you don't click right on the tag here, it's going to adjust the scale of this and your noise will disappear. It's still there. It just changes the scale. But if I go to TX, but let's go ahead and select our raindrops and go to circle, and we want our center. So if I click on this and drop this into X and say export chop reference, you're going to see that it's already starting to twitch all over the place. If I go and drag Y in there and export chop reference, this thing's just noise. It's just going everywhere, right? It's totally random. And that's not what I want, right? What I want is this to pop in and out of existence all around the image. And so I'm going to use a couple different operators to make that happen. So first, to stop this from happening, I'm going to go ahead and just delete these temporarily. We do not need those. You could also just hit undo. And so I am going to use the noise. But what I want to do is I want to be able to essentially hold a value for a certain amount of time that this noise generates so that it's not sliding across the screen. It's basically stopping in a place and then jumping to another place and then jumping to another place. And so fortunately, there is an operator called hold. And what this does is it does something called sampling and holding. And what that means is that it's going to be sampling or essentially listening to the signal coming in. But then when we tell it to hold something, it's going to hold something until we tell it to grab new information. So if I was to go ahead and click and connect these together, if I drop this into the top, you can see it is holding some value. Now, if I click this pulse button for the hold, you'll see that anytime I do a pulse, it's going to be changing that value. So if I was to say use these values now, if I go ahead and lock this, select my raindrops, go up here and drop this into center X, and grab this and drop this into center Y. And then now if I go back to my hold and unlock it, select this and hit pulse, right? You can see that every time I move this, I'm essentially getting like a raindrop, right? So now I need something that can help me automate that process. And that's where there is an operator called pulse, which is perfect for sending pulses. So I'm going to go ahead and double click and I'm going to type in the letter PU, and here is pulse. And by default, pulse sends out a lot of pulses. If I go ahead and drop this into the second thing, you'll see that I'm getting a lot. I'm going to stop my mouse moving. You'll see I'm getting a lot of these different raindrops, right? So I'm getting a lot of pulses. Currently, the number of pulses is set to 8. If I was to increase this to say 25, it should pop much more quickly across the frame, right? A lot more rain. 32 is the maximum of the slider, but I'm pretty sure that you can set it to, let's just go ahead and see if we can do like 100. Oh no, 32 is the maximum number, right? So if you wanted more raindrops, you would probably want to have multiple pulse operators in order to do that, or you might want to use an LFO or something where you can do a faster rate of change. So one of the other options here is if we did an LFO, I believe with the LFO, we can set this to a square wave or a pulse. There we go. We can do a pulse. And we could potentially use this to trigger pulses much more quickly. So right now it's set to, right, not that fast. But if I increase that frequency, right, this may actually be a better bet instead of using the pulse, right? But you can see it's basically flickering this off and on. One of the issues with using pulse is that the width is only a certain length, is only a certain amount, but that should be fine. Now, one of the other things that we can do is, right, what isn't happening here is that this drop is not black unless, right, it's always white. So we're getting kind of a little bit of residual stuff here and it never disappears. And so what we can do is we can actually use either the LFO value, or if we were using the pulse operator, we could use that value, the 0 or the 1, to control the color of our drop. So if I go to my drop here, I think I can just go to fill color. We're going to find out real quick. And I can just say export chop reference. Right, so now it's doing a bit more popping in and out, right? As soon as that pulse disappears, the raindrop is essentially gone. It disappears again. So we don't have that hold on the surface anymore. All right, so this is a way that we can create somewhat of a raindrop effect. Right now, all of the magnification is a little bit too much. Like, we still need to adjust how much displacement is happening here, but we have something that does allow us to do raindrops, which is pretty fantastic. Now, one of the things that we might want to do, and you can kind of see how that flickering is happening, we could also slow this down a little bit. So let's go ahead and dial our frequency down. And you can see this is basically once a second, right? It's dropping our pulse. And you can see once the pulse is done, it goes from white to black again almost instantaneously. And we get this nice kind of drippy droppy effect. Okay. So we've got this set. I'm going to go ahead and temporarily disconnect this wire so the raindrops stop. We could potentially, stop somewhere else. Here we could disconnect anywhere else. But basically this way we just have our plain flat background because we're going to do something over here by our normal maps in order to create additional deviations on the surface. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a noise in a noise top. So we're going to go to noise. And you'll see by default, our noise is black and white. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to change this from monochrome to color. Then we are going to go to our common setting. We're going to make sure that we change this to custom resolution and change this to 1280 by 720. This just makes sure everything plays nicely. And again, pixel format, let's go ahead and do 32-bit. But we could do RGBA. We could just do 32-bit RGB if that's an opportunity down here, which it's not. So maybe we can do 32-bit RG. Either any of these will work, right? And this is going to be like a traditional UV or normal map that we're going to be feeding into here as part of this. And the other thing we need to do is we're going to need to animate this. And there's a couple different types of noise that we could potentially use. First, let's get rid of most of our harmonics for the time being. We can talk about changes to that in a minute. We're also going to reduce our exponent down a bit just because that makes it a little bit more crisp. And we could adjust the amplitude and things, but we're going to leave it set to there. And then under the transform, right now there's a couple of ways we could transform this. If we go to simplex, and let's just do simplex 40, what simplex 40 does is it allows us to have a couple options here. One, we have this translate option in 4D, right, which is going to be translating things in 4D. We can also translate on the X or the Z, and you can kind of see that that does a similar thing. Now, both of these settings, we can use a little bit of code to apply, or to change over time. So if I do abs time dot seconds in here, oops, and don't use two N's. Make sure things are lowercase. The T should be uppercase. And if I do that, you're going to see that now this noise is animated. If I click on translate, that'll pop this up so we can see this more permanently. And so if I go ahead and if I want to slow this down, I can say, let's divide this by 20. Right? And that slows it way down, right? That's not exactly what we want. Let's maybe say 2. And then we can drag this over a little bit. Now what we need to do is we need to add a comp in here. So we're going to right click. We're going to say insert operator, and we want this to be a composite. We don't have a whole lot of space here, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit and move my normal map over, make room for this. And then for the second input, I'm going to go ahead and connect my noise. And now, because this default is set to multiply, that's not going to help us too much. We could probably do add. And so now you can see that we're getting like really sloppy smeariness happening. And okay, so I've added these two together, but this isn't exactly what I would want it to do because of the way that they're blending. It's not really having the effect I would like it to have. What I'd like it to do is to be able to really be displacing the waves, which again, these are too big and there's some other issues with it, but right, what I'd like it to be is displacing the waves and kind of creating like a trough through there as I go. So there's a couple other additions I'm going to need in order to make this work. And so to do that, I'm going to have my displace here. And right, I've got this set with my movie file, but what I really need to do is go ahead and disconnect that composite there. I want to go back to this default, and I'm going to disconnect this link. Because what I'd like to do is I want to displace the noise that I'm using, and then with this source, and then once I've displaced that, use that to displace the final image that I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to change the noise just a little bit the way that I did it, just so we have some similarities. But I'm going to go ahead and grab this noise. I can go ahead and get rid of the comp for the time being. because this is just a slightly better way to do this. I'm going to go ahead and take my noise. Oops. My noise, not a null. I don't know where that null came from, but I'm going to keep the same type of noise. I'm going to adjust my period up, so it's a little bit more scaled up. I'm going to set this to 4. Then I'm going to go ahead and also increase my harmonics to 4. And you can kind of see I'm getting like a much more rippledy kind of noisy effect, but things are like a little bit intense. And so I might increase my amplitude just a touch too, but things are going really, really quickly. So under transform, I am going to go ahead and and just so we can see this other option, I'm going to actually take this, I'm going to cut it. So I'm going to get Command or Control X. I'm going to come down to translate 4D. I'm going to paste it here. And you'll see it's moving really, really quickly. So I'm going to click on the word translate 4D, and I'm going to change this to 10 from 2. So it's going to be divided by 10. So now it's like a little bit more. This to me feels like a more natural rate of water rippling. And it's got enough interesting things going on that it should be good. I'm going to make sure that everything else is set the same. It is. So now I'm going to go ahead and feed this into my displace. And I want you to see that now this ripple is rippling those other ripples, but the displace is not set up the way that I would like it to be. This displace, we need to make a couple adjustments. So we need to set the displace weight to something even tinier. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the displace weight word, hold down while I do that, go down to the 0.01, and I'm just going to go down to 0.06, right? So then this is rippling just a very tiny bit. I'm going to make sure that this is all set to the way that I want this to be. That is correct. Okay, so now I've got this, right? You can see these ripples are happening kind of and impacting the water. So now I'm going to go ahead and create another I'm going to go ahead and since I don't have this in here, I'm going to go ahead and select this normal top. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste it. I'm going to disconnect it from whatever it's connected to. And then I'm going to go ahead and feed this into this displace. And so now I've got these ripples and I've got my other ripples that are rippling on top of the ripples. It's a lot of ripples. And you'll note there's something off here, and I'm not quite sure. Oh, one of the changes that I need to make is that I totally forgot is that in this displace, because this is red and green noise, and this is essentially using red and green as well, I need to change my vertical source from blue to green. Right? And did you see that little nudge that happened? If I set blue, there was some weird smearing that happened up here at the top edge. If I change this to green, then everything is the way it should be. I love those little parameters that make big differences. Okay, so now that I've got this normal set and everything's working, let's go ahead and create another displace. I am going to go ahead and add this as my displace value, this as what I want to be displaced. And if I go ahead and turn that display off and turn this display on, you can see things are really crazy. It does look like a watery surface. However, it's really, the initial image is completely destroyed, right? And again, that's because this displace weight is so high. So if I come down here and do the 0.1s, I can drop down to 0.1 and I start to get something that's close. But again, this is where it would be then good to go down to this and maybe go down to about the same. You can even go down smaller for this final one. It depends on how much of an impact you want this to have. Like, do you want it to be like little bits of wind blowing across the surface, right? Or do you want to have a little bit more impact, right? So if I go up to like 0.3, you can see I've got a little bit more impact here. Those waves are rippling that surface a little bit more fluidly. And again, it really just depends on how intense you want this to be. In the example that I did, I set it to 0.01. But again, it really just depends on, what you're interested in doing. So now we've got this default number of ripples on the surface. We could set, that's something that you could even set to slowly reduce as well. But sometimes, if you want that motion, that endless motion on there, you can have it. We could also potentially even set there to be a slider between either this movie file, or potentially we could have two displaces, one with just the water ripple from raindrops and one with like actual movement. So let's go ahead and do that. And we can use a cross for this. So I'm going to go ahead and double click. I'm going to go to my cross, which is just short for cross dissolve. And for one of those sources, I'm going to use that displacement. For the other source, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this displacement. And I am going to, instead of using this as the displace input, I'm going to go ahead and use this. Right, so now I've got, if I zoom in a little bit here, you can see that, right, I've got those ripples going, but nothing else. I can connect this in here, select this, and right now, if I was to get rid of some of these and just go to this, you can see, and it actually, maybe I need to use something different or do a different way. This actually looks really cool, but it's not useful. But it would allow me to essentially switch from one mode to the other. It's just there's all these values in the middle that may not be useful for my use case, but maybe this is something cool that could be used for a different effect. All right, but so you can see I can mix these together. This is with the ripples, right? And this is without. So one last thing is then we can always go back over here and we can connect our raindrops, right? So we can take this back into this comp. And now we've got raindrops on the surface. If I slide this over, we've got raindrops on the surface and the water is moving. If you're unhappy with the scale of the noise on the surface of this water, right, we can always come back to our noise here. We can go to transform and, oh, that's a cross. What? There we go. We can come over here and we can go to transform and scale, and we could always scale the noise up. We could also adjust the period, right? If I make the period smaller, right, that's going to make that significantly more rippled. I could also I could leave the period at 4, but I could set my harmonics right down to 2 or something, or 3. And you can see that I get, right, a different result on there. But these things allow me to make some of those changes. You can also play with a lot of the other settings on the noise to see if you get, right, any interesting results. You can adjust the harmonic gain to make it stronger. If you want more harmonics, but you want it to be a little bit less impactful, you can do that as well. Here we go. And so you can see that, right, it's waving just a little bit at this point, but it's really, really subtle. If you decrease your exponent value, you can get harder edges. And let's see here, if I pull this down to 2, yeah, let's go down. I'm going to go down even a little bit smaller so you can kind of see this impact a little bit more strongly. If I increase my exponent, that's going to soften things up a little bit. You can kind of see it's really clear what's happening in the normal map down below. So let's see here, where's my exponent? Right, you can see that that's really, there's just barely little pits now, and then you can see I can crank it way down, and I'm going to get like a much more intense result. So sometimes somewhere in here with amplitude, if I dial my amplitude down again, that's going to soften that a little bit. Yeah, there's just a bunch of settings here you can do to kind of change how that noise appears and feels. You could experiment with different types of noise as well.